My phone started vibrating at 3:02 a.m., the kind of hour when no call brings good news. I was already half awake, mothers never really sleep, but when I saw my sister Mara's name glowing on the screen, something inside me dropped. Mara doesn't call in the middle of the night. I answered on the second ring. Jillian? She gasped, her voice shaking so hard I barely recognized it. I need $18,000. Right now. If you don't send it, I'm going to die. For a moment, I thought I was still dreaming. What are you talking about? I whispered, sliding out of bed so I wouldn't wake my son, Theo. I can't tell you, she said quickly. Too quickly. Eric messed up. There are people involved, dangerous people. If we don't pay them by sunrise, they'll come after me. You have to wire it. No questions. Please, Jill, I'm begging you. $18,000. That number wasn't random. It was almost exactly what I had in my emergency savings, the money I'd spent years building while running my lakeside restaurant and raising Theo alone. She knew that. She knew how hard I worked for every dollar. She also knew I would move heaven and earth if someone I loved was in danger. Call the police, I said instinctively. No, she snapped, and the sharpness in her voice made my heart stutter. Then she softened again. You don't understand. If you involve them, it'll only make it worse. Just send the money, and don't tell Mom and Dad. Don't tell anyone. That was the first crack in her story. Mara had always run to our parents first. Always. My thumb hovered over my banking app anyway. I was seconds away from transferring everything when another call came in an unknown number. I ignored it. It rang again, and again. Finally, I answered. Ma'am, a calm male voice said, this is Officer Reynolds. I'm calling regarding your sister, Mara Harper. My blood ran cold. She just called me, I said. She said her life was in danger. There was a pause on the other end. Not confusion. Not urgency. Something else. Ma'am, he said carefully, we need to ask you a few questions, because the story she gave us tonight doesn't match what we're seeing. And in that moment, I realized the $18,000 wasn't meant to save her life. It was meant to hide something. Stay with me, because what I uncovered that night didn't just expose a lie. It shattered everything I thought I knew about my sister and the family I trusted. My name is Jillian Harper. I'm 40 years old, a single mother, and the owner of a lakeside restaurant I built from nothing but stubbornness and sleepless nights. Most people in town know me as the woman who never closes early, the one who balances invoices at midnight and still shows up at school events with flour on her sleeves. But tonight, I'm not telling you a story about business. I'm telling you about the night my sister called me at 3:02 a.m. and asked for $18,000 to save her life. And how, by sunrise, I realized it wasn't her life she was trying to save. It was something far more dangerous. It was quiet when the phone rang, too quiet. The kind of stillness that makes every sound feel amplified. My son Theo was asleep down the hall. The lake outside our house was black and glassy, the dock invisible in the dark. I was drifting somewhere between dreams and awareness when the vibration on my nightstand jolted me upright. I didn't even need to look. Only emergencies come at that hour. When I saw Mara's name glowing on the screen, my stomach tightened. My sister doesn't call in the middle of the night. Mara has always been the composed one, the golden child. The sister who graduates first, marries first, manages the second location of our family restaurant with a polished smile and perfect posture. When she calls, it's usually during business hours and usually to give instructions. I answered on the second ring. Jillian, she gasped. Her voice didn't sound polished. It sounded terrified. I need $18,000. Right now. If you don't send it, I'm going to die. For a moment, my brain refused to process the number. $18,000. It wasn't random. It was almost exactly what I had in my emergency savings, the fund I'd built over years of running Harper's Lakeside and raising Theo alone after my divorce. She knew that. Where are you? I asked, already sliding out of bed, keeping my voice low so I wouldn't wake my son. Are you hurt? I can't explain, she said quickly. Too quickly. Eric messed up. There are people involved. They're not playing around. If we don't pay them before morning, they'll come after me. Please, Jill. I don't have anyone else. That part made me pause. Mara always had someone else. Our parents adored her. They would have wired the money without blinking. So why was she calling me? Why was she telling me not to involve anyone? Call the police, I whispered. No! The word snapped through the phone like a crack of lightning. Then her tone softened instantly, almost rehearsed. You don't understand. If you involve them, it'll make everything worse. Just send it. Don't wake Theo. Don't tell Mom and Dad. Just do this for me. My hand hovered over my banking app. I've spent years protecting what little stability I've built for my son. Theo is 12, quiet, thoughtful. The kind of kid who apologizes when someone bumps into him. Every dollar in that savings account represented safety new equipment for the restaurant, tuition, emergencies. This was an emergency, wasn't it? My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I imagined Mara alone somewhere, in danger. I imagined headlines, regret, guilt, but something wasn't sitting right. Her breathing sounded uneven, but not panicked. Controlled. And she wouldn't tell me where she was. She wouldn't explain what happened. She just kept repeating the same line. Send it, please, before it's too late. I was seconds away from transferring the money when another call flashed across my screen. Unknown number. I ignored it. It rang again. And again. Mara was still on the line, whispering urgently. Don't answer anything. Stay with me. That was the moment the chill hit my spine. Why would she care who else was calling? I muted her and answered the unknown number. Ma'am, a calm male voice said, professional and steady. This is Officer Reynolds. I'm calling regarding your sister, Mara Harper. My blood turned to ice. She just called me, I said. She said her life was in danger. There was a pause on the other end, not confusion, not alarm, something measured. Ma'am, he replied carefully, we need to ask you a few questions, because the statement she gave tonight doesn't match what we're seeing. The words landed like a weight in my chest. What are you seeing? I asked. Security footage, he said. And we believe you may have relevant information. Security footage. My mind jumped immediately, not to criminals, not to threats, but to my backyard. To the cameras I installed last year near the dock. To my son's birthday dinner a week earlier. To the bruise under Theo's eye, and the way the room had gone silent when he whispered, Why did you let him? The officer continued, his tone steady but firm. We just need clarity, ma'am. Your sister is safe at the moment. But the story she's telling us doesn't align with the evidence. Safe. Not kidnapped. Not hunted. Safe. Back on the other line, I could still hear Mara breathing. Waiting. And in that suspended second, something inside me shifted. The $18,000 wasn't about saving her from danger. It was about saving her from exposure. I unmuted the call. Mara, I said slowly, my voice steadier than I felt. What did you do? There was a long silence. Then she whispered, Jill, if you love me, you'll just send it. That was when I knew. This wasn't a ransom. It was a cover-up. And whatever she was trying to bury had roots deeper than one desperate phone call at 3 a.m. If you've ever had someone you love ask you to choose between loyalty and truth, if you've ever felt that moment where the story stops making sense, but your heart doesn't want to admit it, then you'll understand why I didn't send the money. What I uncovered that night didn't just expose a lie. It exposed a pattern, a history, a fracture in my family that had been widening for years. Stay with me, because by the time the sun rose over the lake, I wasn't just questioning my sister. I was questioning everything I thought I knew about my family, and what I was willing to sacrifice to protect my son. After I hung up with Officer Reynolds, I didn't go back to sleep. I couldn't. The house felt different too, still, like it was holding its breath along with me. Theo's door was closed down the hall, a thin strip of light from his nightlamp spilling across the hardwood floor. For a moment, I just stood there, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the faint lap of water against the dock outside. Normal sounds. Safe sounds. The kind you don't appreciate until something threatens to shatter them. Mara was still on the other line. I hadn't officially ended the call. I had just muted it. When I brought the phone back to my ear, she spoke immediately, as if she'd been counting the seconds. "Did you send it?" Her voice wasn't trembling anymore. It was tight, controlled. "No," I said. There was a pause long enough for the silence to turn sharp. "Why not?" "Because a police officer just called me," I answered quietly. "He said the story you gave them doesn't match what they're seeing." The shift in her breathing was subtle, but I caught it. A quick inhale, a recalculation. "What police?" she demanded. Not scared, not confused, angry. "That's what I'm trying to figure out." For years, I had watched my sister pivot through situations with effortless composure. Growing up, she always had an answer before the question was finished. When we were kids and something broke, she somehow turned it into an accident. When we were teenagers and curfews were missed, she framed it as responsibility. Our parents adored that about her, the way she carried herself, the way she made chaos look like confidence. But this was different. This time, she wasn't narrating the story. Someone else was. "Mara," I said slowly, lowering my voice so it wouldn't carry down the hallway. "What happened tonight?" She exhaled sharply. "I told you. Eric made a mistake. It got complicated. We just need money to fix it." "That's not an explanation." "It's enough." That was when the old tension resurfaced, the one that had never quite left. The subtle hierarchy between us. Mara the strategist, me the sentimental sister who worked too hard and asked too many questions. Our parents had always reinforced it. Mara managed the second restaurant location with flair. I managed the original one with grit. They praised her leadership and described my success as stability. It sounded like a compliment, but it never felt equal. And now she wanted $18,000 without context. "Why me?" I asked. "Why didn't you call Mom and Dad?" Another pause. "They don't need to know," she said. That was the second crack. Mara had never shielded our parents from anything. If anything, she curated information to keep them aligned with her. The fact that she didn't want them involved told me this wasn't about danger. It was about control. "You told me not to wake Theo," I continued. "You told me not to tell anyone." That doesn't sound like someone trying to survive. It sounds like someone trying to hide something. Her voice sharpened instantly. "You're overthinking this." "Am I?" Because, as I stood in my kitchen in the dark, pieces of the past week began rearranging themselves in my mind. Theo's birthday dinner. The bruise under his eye. Tucker's smirk. The way Mara had dropped her wine glass when Theo whispered, "Why did you let him?" The way she had insisted it was just boys playing rough. And the message I saw light up on her phone that night. "Did you tell him yet?" At the time, I dismissed it as coincidence. Now it felt like warning. "Mara," I said carefully, "are the police at your house right now?" "Yes," she replied too quickly. "For what?" "Just questions. Actually, and omens." "What kind of questions?" She hesitated. And in that hesitation, I heard something I had never heard from my sister before. Uncertainty. "I can't do this right now," she muttered. "Either you're going to help me or you're not. That depends on what you're asking me to help with." Her tone went cold. "I'm asking you to trust me." That word trust felt heavy in my chest. Trust had been fragile between us for years. It started small, invisible. She pushed for more influence at the restaurant, claiming experience. I pushed back quietly, wanting the original location to remain mine, Theo's someday. Our parents sided with her publicly and called it practicality. I swallowed my frustration because keeping peace felt easier than fighting it. But the peace had always cost something. Usually me. "You're not telling me everything," I said. "And you're not being a good sister," she shot back. The guilt landed exactly where she intended it to. Family had always been our currency. You show up, you defend, you protect the name. That's what our parents drilled into us. Reputation first, conflict private, problems handled quietly. But something inside me had shifted since the officer's call. "What does security footage have to do with any of this?" I asked. Her silence stretched longer this time. "You have cameras at your place, right?" she asked finally. The question froze me. "Yes." "Have you checked them recently?" My pulse kicked up. "Why?" "Just, if anyone asks, tell them nothing happened there." That's all. Nothing happened there. The dock. The backyard. Theo. The memory of him curled slightly inward at dinner, avoiding Tucker's gaze, resurfaced with sharp clarity. Connie telling me she heard crying near the lake the week before. My parents brushing it off. Mara, I whispered, and for the first time my voice shook. Did something happen at my house? She didn't answer directly. You're making this bigger than it is, she said instead. Kids fight. Things get exaggerated. The police always overreact. Kids fight. The phrase echoed in my mind. Was this about Tucker? Was the $18,000 meant for lawyers, not criminals? You told me you were going to die, I said quietly. Another pause. People say things when they're scared, she replied. That was the moment the illusion cracked completely. She wasn't in mortal danger. She was in trouble. And she was trying to pull me into it before I had time to think. The unknown number flashed on my phone again. Officer Reynolds calling back. I have to go, I told her. Jillian, her voice hardened. If you hang up and talk to them without me, you'll regret it. There it was. Not fear. Not desperation. A threat. I ended the call. For a few seconds, I just stood there, staring at my reflection in the dark window above the sink. I looked older than I had yesterday, tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Theo's bedroom door creaked slightly as he shifted inside. I imagined him waking up to sirens, to arguments, to questions he shouldn't have to answer. I picked up the phone and answered the officer. Ma'am, he said, calm and steady. We need to clarify some details about an incident involving your nephew and your son. My stomach dropped, but my voice didn't. I'll cooperate, I said. And in that moment, I understood something with painful clarity. The $18,000 wasn't about saving my sister's life. It was about protecting her version of the truth. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure I was willing to help her do that. When Officer Reynolds said the words, an incident involving your nephew and your son, something inside my chest seemed to fold inward. It wasn't shock exactly, it was recognition. Like a puzzle piece sliding into place, even though I had desperately hoped it wouldn't fit. I leaned against the kitchen counter, gripping the edge to steady myself. What kind of incident? I asked carefully. There was a pause on the other end. The soft rustle of papers. We received a report earlier tonight, he explained. Your sister stated she believed she was being extorted. However, during follow-up, inconsistencies came up. We also spoke to her son, Tucker. His account raised concerns about a prior altercation at your residence last week. My throat tightened. At my house? Yes, ma'am, near the dock area. The dock. I closed my eyes, and the memory came back in full color. Theo's birthday dinner. The string lights glowing softly above the patio. Laughter echoing across the lake. And then, Theo stepping into the dining room with that bruise under his eye, dark and blooming against his pale skin. At the time, I felt it before I understood it. That instinctive drop in a mother's stomach. I remember the way Tucker leaned back in his chair, lanky and loose-limbed, with that careless smirk. I just taught him a lesson, he'd said. Like it was nothing. Like my son was a practice target. My parents had laughed uneasily. Mara had fidgeted with her wine glass. And Theo had looked at me with eyes too old for 12 and whispered, "Why did you let him?" That sentence had never stopped echoing in my mind. I need to ask, the officer continued, drawing me back to the present. Do you have security cameras on your property? Yes, I answered automatically. One by the back entrance and one facing the dock. Have you reviewed footage from last Thursday evening? I hadn't. I felt a surge of guilt so sharp it almost knocked the breath from me. I had installed those cameras after a minor break-in last year. I told myself they were for safety, for peace of mind. But when it came to my own family, I chose peace over proof. No, I admitted quietly. I recommend you do, he said. We'll need a copy. There it was again, that subtle shift from speculation to evidence. Whatever story Mara had told them about extortion and threats, it had unraveled quickly enough for them to circle back to something else entirely. To be clear, I said slowly, my sister called me tonight, asking for $18,000. She said her life was in danger. We're aware she contacted you, he replied evenly. At this time, we have no indication that she is under immediate threat. We are more concerned about potential coercion and intimidation involving minors. Coercion. Intimidation. Minors. Each word landed heavier than the last. Theo. I turned instinctively toward the hallway, as if I could see through walls. His door was still closed. Safe. For now. What did Tucker say? I asked. I can't share full details at this stage, he said, careful and professional. But I strongly advise you to review your footage before having any further conversations with your sister. Any further conversations? The implication was clear. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding between cousins. This was about accountability. When the call ended, the house felt colder. The digital clock on the stove read 3:41 a.m. The world outside remained silent and indifferent, but inside me everything was shifting. I thought about Mara's voice just minutes earlier. The urgency. The command. If you love me, you'll just send it. That was the part that stayed with me. Not the fear, not the money, the condition attached to love. If you love me. It was a phrase she'd used our entire lives. If you love me, cover for me. If you love me, don't argue. If you love me, trust me. Growing up, Mara always framed loyalty as proof of devotion. I was the younger sister who followed her lead, who softened the edges of her sharper decisions. When she wanted more control over the second restaurant location, I supported her. When she convinced our parents that she should handle vendor contracts, I didn't push back. It was easier to preserve the illusion of harmony than to question it. But this wasn't about contracts or control anymore. This was about my son. I walked quietly to the study and sat down at my desk. The glow of my laptop lit up the dark room. For a moment, my fingers hovered above the keyboard. I didn't want to see what the footage might show. There was still a small part of me that wanted the officer to be mistaken, that wanted Tucker's lesson to have been nothing more than reckless teenage behavior. But Theo's voice echoed again. Why did you let him? The security app loaded slowly, the spinning circle stretching seconds into something unbearable. I scrolled to the date of the birthday dinner. Thursday, 7 p.m. The camera angle from the backyard flickered to life in grainy night vision. The dock illuminated by pale infrared light, the edge of the lawn visible. Movement. I leaned closer to the screen. Theo stood near the dock, shoulders slightly hunched, hands tucked awkwardly at his sides. Tucker approached him, taller, broader, already carrying himself with that restless energy I had noticed too many times before. For a few seconds, they faced each other. I couldn't hear the audio, but I didn't need to. Tucker stepped forward. Theo stepped back. Then Tucker shoved him. Hard. Theo stumbled and fell onto the grass near the dock. I saw the moment his head snapped slightly to the side when it hit the ground. My breath caught. I watched as Tucker stood over him. Not panicked, not apologetic, dominant. And then I saw something that made my hands start shaking. Mara. She was standing a few feet away, arms crossed, watching, not intervening, not pulling Tucker back, watching. I paused the footage, but it didn't stop replaying in my mind. That calm stance, that absence of urgency, she had been there. The room felt like it was closing in. The $18,000 suddenly made horrifying sense. If the police had spoken to Tucker and his version didn't hold up, if they were investigating intimidation or bullying, then Mara wasn't afraid of criminals. She was afraid of exposure. I pushed my chair back and stood abruptly. My first instinct was to wake Theo, to hold him, to ask him everything I should have asked sooner. But I stopped myself. He didn't need to relive it in the middle of the night. Instead, I replayed the footage again, slower this time. At one point, Tucker kicked dirt toward Theo. Not violently, but dismissively, like he was proving a point. Teach him a lesson. The words Tucker had used at dinner echoed through me like a verdict. And suddenly the 3 a.m. phone call felt less like panic and more like strategy. If Mara could move quickly enough, secure money, hire representation, control the narrative, she could keep it contained, keep it private, keep it from becoming something official. The final frame before I closed the video showed Theo pushing himself up slowly, brushing grass from his shirt. No one helped him. I swallowed hard. For years, I had tried to keep peace between us. I had ignored the subtle digs, the comparisons, the favoritism from our parents. I told myself rivalry between siblings was normal, that teenage boys roughhoused, that I was being overly protective. But watching that footage stripped away every excuse. My phone buzzed again. A text from Mara. Did you send it? I stared at the message, then looked back at the paused image on my screen. My son on the ground. My sister standing still. No, I hadn't sent the money. And now, I knew I never would. I didn't sleep after that. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same frozen frame Theo on the ground near the dock, small against the wide stretch of dark grass, and Mara standing there with her arms crossed like she was watching a rehearsal instead of her nephew being shoved. By the time the sky outside began to fade from black to deep blue, I had replayed the footage more times than I could count. Each viewing peeled away another layer of denial I didn't even realize I was holding on to. The first time I watched it, I searched for context. Maybe Tucker tripped him. Maybe it escalated accidentally. Maybe Mara stepped in right after the frame cut off. But no matter how many times I reviewed it, the pattern stayed the same. Tucker approached. Theo retreated. Tucker shoved. Mara watched. No urgency. No intervention. No shock. Just observation. At 6:12 a.m., my phone rang again. Officer Reynolds. Ma'am, he said, his tone steady and measured. Were you able to review the footage? Yes, I answered, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. I have it. There was a brief silence, the kind that carries weight. Does it show an altercation? Yes. I didn't elaborate. I didn't need to. The word felt heavy enough on its own. He exhaled softly. Thank you for checking. We're trying to understand the full sequence of events. Your sister reported that her son was being harassed and that she feared retaliation from your family. However, preliminary interviews suggest a different dynamic. Harassed. Retaliation. The irony nearly made me laugh, but it caught in my throat instead. She told me her life was in danger, I said. She asked for $18,000 to fix it. I'm aware, he replied. At this point, we have no evidence of an external threat. What we are examining is whether there was intimidation involving your son, and whether any attempt was made to influence statements or conceal information. Influence statements. Conceal information. The 3 a.m. call. The demand for secrecy. Did she mention the footage to you? I asked. She indicated that there might be cameras on your property, he said carefully. She seemed concerned about how it would be interpreted. Concerned about interpretation. Not about Theo. Not about Tucker. About optics. That was Mara in a single sentence. What happens next? I asked. We would like a copy of the recording, he said. You can email it directly or bring it to the station later today. We'll also be speaking with your son, but we'll do so in a sensitive manner and only with your consent. The word sensitive hit differently than everything else he had said, because that was the part that mattered most. Not legal classifications, not narratives. Theo. I want to talk to him first, I said firmly. Of course. When the call ended, I closed my laptop slowly, like I was sealing something away. The sun was fully rising now, light spilling across the lake in soft gold streaks. From the outside, nothing looked broken. The water was still, the dock quiet, the world intact. Inside, everything had shifted. Theo's door opened a few minutes later, and he padded down the hallway in socks, hair rumpled, eyes still heavy with sleep. He stopped when he saw me already dressed and sitting at the kitchen table. You're up early, he said softly. So are you, I replied, forcing a small smile. He poured himself cereal and sat across from me, legs swinging slightly under the chair. For a moment, I just watched him. The bruise under his eye had faded to a faint yellow shadow, but I could still see it if I looked closely. It wasn't just the mark that haunted me. It was the way he had avoided my gaze that night at dinner. The way he had asked me a question instead of giving me an answer. Why did you let him? Theo, I began carefully. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. He stiffened almost imperceptibly, just enough that a mother would notice. Okay. I looked at the cameras from your birthday. His spoon paused halfway to his mouth. I saw what happened by the dock. The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before. He pushed me, Theo said finally, staring down at his bowl. His voice wasn't angry. It wasn't tearful. It was factual. I know. There was another pause. Then, quieter. It wasn't the first time. That sentence felt like a blade sliding slowly through something fragile inside me. What do you mean? I asked, keeping my tone steady even though my pulse was racing. He says I act like I'm better than him, Theo said. Because Grandpa likes me, because of the restaurant. I don't write calm. I closed my eyes briefly. So that was it. Not random aggression. Not teenage roughhousing. Resentment. Fueled by comparisons none of these boys should have been carrying in the first place. Did Aunt Mara see? I asked. He nodded. Did she say anything? His shoulders tightened. She told him to make sure I understood. Understood what? My hands curled slightly against the table, but I kept my voice calm. Understood what, sweetheart? That it's not really mine. The restaurant, the legacy, the future I had quietly promised him, without ever turning it into pressure. I felt a rush of anger, not explosive, but steady and hot. Not at Tucker alone. At the adults who had let ambition seep into a child's world. Theo, I said gently, reaching across the table. You did nothing wrong. He shrugged, but his eyes flicked up to meet mine for just a second. Searching. The police may want to talk to you, I continued. Only if you're comfortable. I'll be there the whole time. He nodded slowly. Okay. There was trust in that response, and that trust felt like both a gift and a responsibility. After he left for school, I sent the footage to Officer Reynolds. My fingers didn't shake this time. There was no hesitation, no guilt, only clarity. An hour later, my phone buzzed again. Mara. I stared at her name for several seconds before answering. What did you tell them? She demanded immediately. I gave them the footage, I replied evenly. You had no right. It's my house. You're blowing this out of proportion, she snapped. Tucker is a kid. So is Theo. There was a sharp inhale on the other end. Then, colder. If this turns into something bigger, don't expect we'll forget how you handled it. There it was again. The subtle warning. The implication that loyalty was conditional. You called me at 3 a.m. and lied, I said quietly. You told me you were going to die. I was scared. Of what? I asked. Consequences? Silence. For the first time in my life, I didn't rush to fill it. You always think you're protecting him, she said finally, voice low. But you're just making him soft. The accusation settled between us like a dividing line. No, I answered. I'm making him safe. When I hung up, I felt something strange. Not triumph. Not relief. Something steadier. Enver powers. The $18,000 had been a test. A reflex she expected me to follow without question. But the moment I saw that footage, the dynamic changed. This wasn't about sibling rivalry. It wasn't about business control. It was about a child who had been pushed to the ground and told to understand his place. And I had finally decided which side of that line I stood on. By mid-morning, the house no longer felt like mine. It felt like a crime scene, not in the dramatic, tape across the doorway way, but in the subtle way truth lingers in the air after it's been exposed. The lake outside was bright now, sunlight scattering across the surface in fractured reflections. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, it felt like a backdrop to something I had failed to see sooner. After Theo left for school, I walked back into the study and watched the footage again. Not because I doubted it, not because I needed confirmation, but because I needed to understand the details I had overlooked. This time I didn't focus on Tucker. I focused on Mara. She was positioned slightly behind him at first, near the edge of the dock's shadow. Her posture wasn't tense. She wasn't startled. There was no visible attempt to intervene. When Tucker shoved Theo, she didn't step forward. She didn't even flinch. And that detail hurt more than the shove itself. I had always known Mara was ambitious, competitive, protective of her own son in a way that sometimes crossed into blindness. But watching her stand there while mine hit the ground, watching her allow that imbalance of power shifted something fundamental in me. My phone buzzed on the desk, a text from my mother. Mara says there's confusion. Please don't escalate this. The phrasing was almost clinical. Confusion. As if what I saw could be reclassified into something gentler if we just adjusted the vocabulary. I didn't answer. Instead, I let my mind drift back to that night, the birthday dinner. The memory unfolded now with sharper edges than before. The candles, the cake, the low hum of conversation. I remember stepping into the dining room and seeing Theo hesitate in the doorway. I remember thinking he looked pale. Then I saw the bruise. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't bloody. Just a dark swelling beneath his eye. Enough to make my stomach drop. What happened? I had asked, sharper than I intended. Before Theo could answer, Tucker leaned back in his chair, stretching his long legs out as if he owned the room. I just taught him a lesson, he said with a smirk. My father chuckled awkwardly. Boys will be boys. Mara avoided my gaze, swirling her wineglass with deliberate calm. At the time, I pressed for details, but Theo shrugged it off. He said it was nothing, that they were messing around. I remember the way his eyes flicked toward Mara before he spoke. I noticed it, but I didn't challenge it. And then he asked me that question. Why did you let him? I thought he meant why did I let Tucker tease him? I thought he meant why did I let them roughhouse? Now I understood. He wasn't asking about the moment. He was asking about the pattern. Around noon, Officer Reynolds called again to confirm receipt of the footage. He thanked me for sending it and assured me they would handle the situation carefully. There was no urgency in his tone, but there was gravity. The kind that tells you something is shifting in official records somewhere. After I hung up, I finally replied to my mother. There's no confusion. I saw it. Her response came almost immediately. Family doesn't need police involved. The irony nearly made me dizzy. Family had been involved. Family had been present. Family had stood by and watched. And that was exactly why this wasn't something I could smooth over. An hour later, Mara showed up at my door unannounced. She didn't knock gently. She knocked with precision, 3 sharp raps that echoed through the hallway. I opened it slowly. She looked composed, hair brushed, sunglasses perched on her head like she was heading to a meeting, not a confrontation. Only her eyes betrayed something unsettled beneath the surface. You sent it, she said without greeting. Yes. It's not the Raider. Her jaw tightened. You could have talked to me first. I did. At 3 a.m, when you asked for $18,000. That was different. Was it? She stepped inside without invitation, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. You don't understand what this is going to do, she said. Tucker's record, his future. You think the world is gentle with boys who get labeled? And what about Theo's future? I asked quietly. She didn't answer immediately. He pushed him, she said finally. Like that minimized everything. It wasn't assault. It wasn't criminal. It was a push. You told him to make sure Theo understood. Her head snapped toward me. Theo said that? Yes. She scoffed, but it was brittle. He twists things. He's 12. And Tucker's 15, she shot back. You act like he's some kind of monster. I act like he needs boundaries. She crossed her arms, mirroring the posture from the footage without realizing it. You've always favored Theo. The statement caught me off guard. He's my son. And Tucker is mine, she replied, her voice rising slightly. You don't know what it's like to raise a boy like him. No, I said evenly. But I know what it's like to raise a boy who thinks he deserves to be pushed. The silence between us was heavier now. You could have kept this private, she said after a moment. Handled it as a family. Family was there, I replied. Family didn't stop it. Is offers. Her eyes flickered, and for a split second I saw something raw beneath the defensive exterior. Not guilt exactly. Something closer to fear. You don't know how this looks, she murmured. That sentence confirmed everything. This wasn't about what happened. It was about how it would look. I'm not managing optics, I said quietly. I'm protecting my child. She let out a slow breath and ran a hand through her hair. You're overreacting. Am I? I walked to the desk and turned the laptop screen toward her. The paused frame illuminated both of us in its glow. Theo on the ground, Tucker looming, Mara in the background. She stared at it for a long time. Then she looked away first. It's not what it looks like, she whispered. It's exactly what it looks like. Her composure cracked, then not dramatically, but in the subtle tightening of her mouth, the flicker of calculation returning. You always wanted control of the main restaurant, she said. This is convenient. The accusation stung not because it was true, but because it revealed how she viewed me. Everything a transaction, everything a move. This has nothing to do with the restaurant, I said. It always does, she replied softly. Maybe that was the tragedy of it. For her, everything filtered through competition, legacy, inheritance, positioning. For me, it was simpler. A child had been hurt. A mother had watched. And another mother had finally decided she wasn't going to pretend it was normal. When Mara left, she didn't slam the door. She closed it carefully, like she was preserving something fragile. But whatever balance had existed between us was already broken. I stood in the quiet house again, listening to the lake outside, and realized something that felt both painful and liberating. For years, I had tried to keep peace by absorbing tension. But peace that requires silence isn't peace. It's permission, and I was done giving it. After Mara left that afternoon, the house felt unusually quiet, not peaceful, but suspended, like something irreversible had already been set in motion and was now simply waiting to unfold. I stood by the kitchen window for a long time, staring out at the dock. In daylight, it looked harmless, just weathered woods stretching over calm water. If you didn't know what had happened there, you would never guess it had become the center of everything. That was the strange part about truth. It doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's just ordinary spaces holding extraordinary consequences. I thought back to the moment I first sensed something was wrong before the cameras, before the police, before the 3 a.m. call. It had been a week earlier, just after closing the restaurant. I'd stepped outside to clear my head. Running Harper's Lakeside meant long days and longer nights. That evening, the lake had been still, the air cool, the kind of quiet that makes you slow down without realizing it. And that's when I heard Mara's voice near the dock. She was on the phone, pacing. I hadn't meant to eavesdrop. I was just stepping onto the porch when her tone caught my attention, sharp, clipped, nothing like her usual polished composure. Dad's giving Theo everything, she said. It's ridiculous. I froze. The lake carried sound easily at night. Her words traveled clearly across the short stretch of yard between us. He's 12, she continued. He doesn't even understand what it takes to run a place like this. Someone needs to make sure he knows his place. Knows his place. At the time, I told myself she was venting. Siblings argue, rivalries flare up. Our parents had always compared us, sometimes subtly, sometimes not. When I announced plans to eventually pass the original restaurant to Theo, I remember my mother's hesitant smile and my father's silence. They had always assumed leadership would consolidate under Mara's branch of the family. Still, I never imagined resentment would spill over into our children. That night by the dock, I stayed hidden in the shadows longer than I cared to admit. I didn't want confrontation. I didn't want another argument about legacy or control. When she ended the call, she paused for a moment, glancing toward the house. I stepped back before she could see me. I convinced myself it wasn't worth addressing. Now, replaying those words in my mind, I realized it wasn't frustration I'd overheard. It was strategy. Later that same week, I noticed small shifts that didn't register at the time. Tucker had been quieter than usual when he came by the restaurant. Not apologetic, not guilty, just observant. Watching Theo from across the room with a look I couldn't quite name. Not dislike, not anger, something closer to competition. And Theo had grown more withdrawn. He used to tell me about everything, what he was reading, what he was thinking, even his small disappointments at school. But that week, he answered in shorter sentences. Spent more time alone in his room. I attributed it to adolescence, beginning to nudge at the edges of childhood. I was wrong. The more I pieced it together, the clearer the pattern became. Mara's comments about favoritism. My parents' subtle reinforcement of it. Tucker absorbing those dynamics like oxygen. Theo internalizing them, without knowing how to articulate what he felt. That night, after reviewing the footage and confronting Mara, I sat down with Theo again. Not to interrogate, just to listen. Has Tucker said things before? I asked gently. Theo hesitated, twisting the edge of his hoodie sleeve. Sometimes, he admitted. He says Grandpa talks about me too much. That I don't deserve it. Deserve what? The restaurant, the house, the lake. My chest tightened. I never said it was his, Theo added quickly, almost defensively. I don't even want it right now. I like being there. I reached across the couch and took his hand. None of this is about deserving, I said softly. And none of it is something you have to earn from anyone. After, he nodded. But I could see doubt flicker behind his eyes. Doubt planted by comparison, by overheard conversations, by adult ambition bleeding into a child's world. The next morning, my father called. Jillian, he began in that measured tone he uses when he thinks he's being reasonable. Your mother says you've made this bigger than necessary. Bigger than necessary? I repeated. Kids, roughhouse, he said. It's unfortunate, but it's not criminal. Involving authorities sends a message. And force. Yes, I replied evenly. It does, he sighed. You know Mara feels threatened. By a 12-year-old? By perception, he corrected. You've always been sensitive about legacy. There it was again. Legacy. As if this entire situation could be reframed as a business dispute instead of what it was. This isn't about business, I said quietly. It's about behavior. He didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice softened. Family should protect its own. I answered. That was the part they didn't seem to understand. Protection isn't always comfortable. Sometimes it disrupts the story people prefer to tell. Later that afternoon, Connie stopped by the restaurant office. She had been with me through everything the early years of rebuilding after my divorce, the slow climb back to stability. She knew the family dynamics without needing them spelled out. I heard, she said gently, closing the door behind her. I nodded. You okay? The question caught me off guard. I had been so focused on Theo that I hadn't allowed myself to register what this was costing me personally. My relationship with my sister. The illusion of alignment with my parents. The fragile peace I'd maintained for years. I don't know yet, I admitted. She leaned against the desk. You're doing the right thing. I hope so. Hope isn't the word, she replied softly. Clarity is. Clarity. That's what the footage had given me. Not satisfaction. Not victory. Just clarity. That evening, as I locked up the restaurant, I stood outside for a moment and looked at the sign Harper's Lakeside. The name felt heavier than it used to. Shared history. Shared expectations. Shared entitlement. I thought about what it means to pass something down, not just property or ownership, but values, safety, accountability, integrity. If Theo was going to inherit anything from me, it wouldn't just be a business. It would be the understanding that no one gets to push him down and call it a lesson, and no one gets to disguise resentment as protection. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the lake darkened again, I felt the final piece settle into place. Mara's 3 a.m. call hadn't been born out of sudden panic. It had been the culmination of something brewing for weeks, maybe longer. Conversations by the dock, comparisons at family dinners, quiet encouragement wrapped in plausible deniability. But the moment Tucker shoved Theo, and Mara stood still, that brewing turned into action. And once action happens, you don't get to pretend it was just tension anymore. You have to name it. I finally had. And naming it meant I could no longer ignore it. That night, after everything had begun to unravel, I couldn't stop thinking about one small detail. I had almost ignored the message that flashed across Mara's phone during Theo's birthday dinner. At the time, it seemed insignificant. A flicker of light on a screen, a glance too quick to read clearly. But now, with everything laid bare, it felt like a missing link I should have recognized sooner. The dining room had been warm with candlelight that evening. String lights hung over the patio doors, casting soft reflections against the lake. Staff from the restaurant had stopped by to drop off dessert trays. A few neighbors lingered near the buffet table. It should have been simple. Just a family dinner. Just a birthday. Theo had been smiling when he blew out the candles, but it hadn't reached his eyes. I remember watching Mara as she refilled her wine glass. Her movements were too controlled. Tucker was unusually quiet, his earlier smirk replaced by something tighter. He kept glancing at his mother as if waiting for instruction. And then her phone lit up. She had been holding it low, near the table's edge. The screen illuminated her face briefly. I caught only a fragment of the message before she turned it downward. "Did you tell him yet?" That was all I saw. 3 words. At the time, I told myself it could mean anything. Maybe it was about a work issue. Maybe about our parents. Maybe about something unrelated to us entirely. But her reaction didn't match neutrality. Her fingers tightened around the phone. Her smile faltered just a fraction before she tucked it into her purse. Tucker leaned closer to her and whispered something sharp, his voice low but urgent. She nodded slightly in response. It had been subtle. Subtle enough that no one else seemed to notice. Except me. And even then, I chose not to push. That memory now felt like a warning I had failed to interpret. 2 days after sending the footage to the police, I finally asked Theo about it. "Did Aunt Mara ever say anything to you before the doc?" I asked gently while we were sitting on the couch after dinner. He was quiet for a moment, then he nodded. "She told me Grandpa worries I won't be strong enough," he said. The statement stunned me. "Strong enough for what?" "For everything," he replied, shrugging lightly as if it didn't matter. "Did she say that in front of Tucker?" "Yes." I closed my eyes briefly. There it was. Influence doesn't always look like commands. Sometimes it's suggestion. Seeds planted in passing comments. A narrative shaped quietly over time. "Did you tell him yet?" Maybe the message wasn't about Theo at all. Maybe it was about preparing Tucker. Preparing him to confront. Preparing him to assert. Preparing him to teach a lesson. When I returned to the restaurant the next morning, I found my mother waiting for me in the office. She rarely came in unannounced. Her presence there felt deliberate. "Your father says you've involved outside parties," she began, not bothering with pleasantries. "I sent footage when requested," I replied calmly. She sighed, settling into the chair opposite mine. "This is spiraling. Mara is upset. So is Theo." "That's not the same," she said quickly. I let the silence hang between us. "You're interpreting everything through emotion," she continued. "You always have. And what are you interpreting it through?" I asked quietly. "Reputation?" Her lips pressed together. "Families disagree," she said. "But we don't invite scrutiny." "Scrutiny was invited the moment he pushed my son," I answered. She shook her head. "You're making Tucker into something he's not." "No," I said evenly. "I'm asking him to be responsible for something he did." There was a long pause. "She didn't mean harm," my mother said finally. The phrasing caught me. "She?" I asked. She looked startled, as if she hadn't realized the slip. "You said she didn't mean harm," I pressed gently. "She was frustrated," my mother corrected quickly. "There's pressure on that boy." "Pressure? From where? From whom?" Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You're overcomplicating this. Let it go." No signature, no name. But I knew. The timing was too precise. I didn't respond. Instead, I scrolled back through my messages from the night of the birthday dinner. There it was again, Mara texting me after she left. "We need to talk before Dad finds out." At the time, I assumed she meant about Theo's bruise. Now it felt broader, more urgent. That week had been full of small urgencies I had brushed aside. Tucker hovering near Theo more often than usual. Mara insisting on reviewing financial projections for the future. My father making an offhand remark about consolidating management when the boys are older. The boys. As if they were competitors already. As if legacy was a competition bracket waiting to fill in. The more I thought about it, the clearer the pattern became. Tucker wasn't acting in isolation. He was reacting to a narrative, a belief that something was being taken from him, that something belonged to him by default. And someone had fed that belief. That evening, I received another call from Officer Reynolds. He informed me that preliminary interviews confirmed there had been ongoing tension between the boys. Tucker admitted to pushing Theo, but described it as correcting him. Correcting. That word chilled me more than anything else. Was there discussion beforehand? I asked carefully. There appears to have been conversation suggesting your son needed to be reminded of boundaries, he said diplomatically. Boundaries. The language was so clean, so sanitized. But beneath it was the same message I had overheard by the doc. Make sure he knows his place. After the call ended, I sat alone in the dim office of the restaurant long after closing. The staff had gone home. The kitchen was silent. I stared at the reflection of the dining room in the dark windows. I used to believe family tension was something you managed quietly, something you smoothed over with patience and compromise. I thought rivalry was inevitable but harmless if left unchecked. I was wrong. Rivalry becomes something else when adults reinforce it, when children absorb it, when silence becomes endorsement. The message on Mara's phone wasn't random. It was coordination. Not criminal in the dramatic sense, not sinister in the obvious way, but intentional enough to shift behavior, to influence action. Did you tell him yet? Yes, she had. And the lesson had been delivered. The bruise had faded from Theo's face. But the imprint of that message, the implication that he needed correction for existing, would have lasted far longer if I had allowed it. As I locked up the restaurant and stepped outside into the cooling night air, I realized something with quiet certainty. The most dangerous parts of this story weren't loud. They were subtle. A text message, a whispered suggestion, a smirk at a dinner table, and the assumption that I would look the other way. But I wasn't looking away anymore. 2 days after the footage was sent to the police, Connie asked if she could come by the house. She didn't sound alarmed on the phone, just steady, the way she always does when something important needs to be said carefully. Connie has worked beside me at Harper's Lakeside for years. She knows the rhythm of my life, the way only someone who's been in the trenches with you can. She's seen me rebuild the restaurant after my divorce. She's seen me stay up until 2 in the morning balancing payroll. She's seen Theo grow up behind the host stand doing homework while I closed out registers. If anyone could tell me something difficult without making it worse, it was her. When she arrived, we sat at the kitchen table, facing the lake. The afternoon light stretched long and soft across the water, almost mocking the heaviness in the room. I should have said something sooner, she began quietly. My stomach tightened. Said something about what? She folded her hands together on the table. Last week, before the birthday, I was dropping off some paperwork you forgot in the office, and I came around back because the front door was locked. The doc. I heard voices, she continued. Theo's. And Tucker's. My chest felt hollow. What did you hear? Crying, she said simply. Not loud, not dramatic, just scared. The word hit differently than anything else. Scared. I didn't see what happened, she added quickly. By the time I reached the corner of the house, they were already separating. Tucker walked toward the driveway. Theo stayed by the dock. Did Mara say anything? I asked. Connie hesitated. She was there. She told Tucker, that's enough. But it didn't sound like she was upset. It sounded like timing. Timing. Not correction. Not protection. Just managing when it was finished. I leaned back in my chair, trying to absorb it without letting anger rush ahead of clarity. The footage had shown the shove. Theo had admitted it wasn't the first time. Now Connie confirmed the pattern extended beyond a single moment. Why didn't you tell me? I asked gently. She looked down at her hands. Because I wasn't sure what I saw. And because it's family. I didn't want to create a bigger problem. There it was again. That instinct to preserve peace. I understand, I said quietly. And I did. For years, I'd done the same thing. Later that evening, my parents called and asked to come over. Their tone was measured, polite, but firm. I knew what that meant. This wasn't a visit, it was an intervention. They arrived just before sunset. My father stood straight as always, shoulders squared. My mother carried that familiar expression of concern, layered over subtle disapproval. "We need to talk," my father began once we were seated. "I figured," I replied. "You've involved authorities," he said carefully. "That escalates things unnecessarily." "Unnecessarily?" I repeated. My mother interjected softly. "Tucker is a teenager. Teenagers push boundaries." "He pushed my son," I said evenly. "And that's regrettable," she replied. "But involving outsiders damages the family." The phrasing was deliberate. "Damages the family, not damages Theo." "Family was present," I said calmly. "Family didn't stop it." My father's jaw tightened. "You're implying negligence." "I'm stating what happened. It not my thing." Silence settled heavily across the room. "Your sister feels attacked," my mother said after a moment. "I feel betrayed," I answered. My father leaned forward. "Jillian, we built something here. The restaurant, the name. We've worked decades to maintain respect in this town." "And what does that have to do with Theo being pushed?" I asked quietly. "It has to do with perception," he said. Perception. That word again. Everything came back to how it looked. I glanced toward the hallway where Theo's room was. He was inside, reading as he often did when tension filled the house. He didn't deserve to become a footnote in a conversation about optics. "Connie heard him crying last week," I said, watching their faces carefully. This wasn't isolated. My mother's expression flickered. "Children exaggerate," she replied quickly. "Do they?" I asked. My father exhaled slowly. "Mara says Theo provokes him." Dash the taining. The statement hung in the air like something fragile and offensive at the same time. "How?" I asked. "He talks about inheriting the main location," my father said. I blinked. "Theo doesn't talk like that," I replied. "He barely talks about the future at all." "He talks about it to Tucker," my father insisted. "And that justifies being pushed?" "No," my mother said quickly. "But it explains tension." I was not going. I felt a steady heat rise in my chest, not explosive anger, but something quieter and more resolute. "Tension between adults is one thing," I said. "But when adults frame it in front of children, they absorb it." My father shifted in his seat. "You're reading too much into this." "I watched the footage," I replied. They both went still. "You saw it?" my mother asked. "Yes." "And?" my father pressed. "And she stood there," I said quietly. "She watched." Axard. That detail seemed to unsettle them more than the shove itself. "She wouldn't allow harm," my mother said reflexively. "She did." The room fell silent again. After a long moment, my father spoke more softly. "If this becomes official, it follows Tucker." "And if it doesn't," I replied, "it follows Theo." That was the line neither of them had fully considered. The weight of it settled slowly between us. My mother looked toward the window, avoiding my eyes. "You're choosing conflict," she said. "I'm choosing clarity," I answered. They stayed a while longer, repeating variations of the same concern. Reputation, future, unity. But none of it addressed the core issue. No one had said the simplest thing. No one had said what happened was wrong. After they left, I found Theo sitting at the edge of his bed, book closed in his lap. "Are we in trouble?" he asked quietly. The question pierced me. "No," I said firmly, sitting beside him. "You're not in trouble, and you're not the cause of this." He studied my face for a moment, as if measuring the truth of it. "I don't want everyone mad," he whispered. "I know," I said softly, "but sometimes people are upset when things change." He nodded slowly. I wrapped my arm around his shoulders and felt how small he still was, despite everything adults had projected onto him. He shouldn't be carrying legacy, or rivalry, or adult resentment. He should be carrying books and scraped knees and ordinary childhood worries. That night, as I stood by the dock again, the wood cool beneath my feet, I thought about how easy it would have been to let this fade, to accept the apology that hadn't been fully offered, to convince myself it was a one-time misstep. But Connie's quiet confession, the footage, Theo's hesitation, they all told the same story. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a pattern. And patterns don't dissolve with silence. They deepen. The lake was still again, reflecting the moon in fractured pieces. I realized something standing there in the dark. For years, I had been afraid of disrupting family harmony. But harmony that depends on ignoring harm isn't harmony at all. It's compliance. And I wasn't willing to teach my son that compliance was the price of belonging. That night, after my parents left, and the house finally settled into silence again, I knew I was standing at a crossroads. For days, everything had felt reactive, responding to calls, reviewing footage, answering questions. But now, for the first time, I understood that waiting wasn't neutral anymore. Waiting was a decision. Silence was a decision. Pretending this would dissolve on its own was a decision. And every one of those decisions would shape what Theo believed about his own worth. I stood in my study again, the desk lamp casting a soft circle of light over the laptop. The security footage was still open, paused on that now familiar frame. Theo, pushing himself up from the grass, brushing dirt off his sleeve while Tucker stood a few feet away, hands on his hips. Mara, in the background, watching. The first time I saw it, I felt shock. The second time, anger. Now, I felt something steadier. Resolve. For years, I had chosen peace over confrontation. Not because I was weak, but because I believed stability mattered more than being right. Running a restaurant teaches you that quickly sometimes. You smooth over small tensions because escalating them costs more than absorbing them. But this wasn't a business dispute. This wasn't about pride. This was about what kind of line I was willing to draw. I picked up my phone and called Officer Reynolds. "I'd like to move forward formally," I said. There was no hesitation in my voice this time. "We'll document your statement," he replied, "and we'll proceed carefully. Our priority is ensuring everyone's safety." Safety. That word grounded me more than anything else. When I hung up, I leaned back in my chair and allowed myself to breathe fully for the first time all day. The air in the room felt lighter not because the situation was resolved, but because I had stopped resisting the direction it needed to go. An hour later, my phone buzzed again. Mara. I stared at her name before answering. "What did you do?" she asked immediately. "I cooperated," I replied evenly. "You're turning this into something it doesn't need to be." "It already was something," I said. "You just didn't expect it to be seen." There was a long pause. "You could have come to me," she insisted. "We could have handled this privately." "Privately, how?" I asked. "By asking me for $18,000 at 3 in the morning?" Her breath hitched slightly, but she recovered quickly. "That was different." "No," I said quietly. "It wasn't." Silence again. Then, softer, almost coaxing, "Jill, think about the long-term impact. Tucker is young. A record could follow him." "And what follows Theo if I do nothing?" I asked. She didn't answer. That was the heart of it. Everyone was calculating Tucker's future. No one was calculating Theo's. "You've always been sensitive about fairness," she said finally, her tone shifting toward familiar territory. "But life isn't fair. It's competitive." "He's 12, I replied. "And competition starts early." There it was. Not a slip, not an accident. A belief that this was normal. That pushing someone down to assert dominance was part of preparing them for the world. "I'm not raising him to accept that," I said. Her voice cooled instantly. "Then don't expect us to pretend you're right." I ended the call before it could spiral further. Later that evening, Theo and I sat at the kitchen table doing homework. The house felt quieter than usual, not tense, but watchful. He kept glancing at me, as if measuring something unspoken. "Are you mad at Aunt Mara?" he asked finally. I considered the question carefully. "I'm disappointed," I said. He nodded slowly. "Are Grandpa and Grandma mad?" he asked. "Maybe," I admitted. "But that doesn't change what's right." He was quiet for a moment, then said something that caught me off guard. "I didn't want you to fight." "I know," I said softly. "I just wanted it to stop." That was the part adults often miss. Children don't want justice in the dramatic sense. They want stability. They want safety. They want the uncomfortable thing to end. "I'm not fighting," I told him gently. "I'm protecting." He studied my face, searching for certainty. "Does that mean we won't see them anymore?" he asked. "I don't know yet," I answered honestly. "But it means no one gets to treat you like that again." He nodded, and for the first time since the birthday dinner, his shoulders seemed slightly less hunched. After he went to bed, I walked down to the dock. The wood creaked softly under my feet. The lake stretched out dark and endless in front of me. This was the place where the shove happened. The place where resentment became action. The place where silence almost won. I sat at the edge and let my feet dangle just above the water. For years, I had believed compromise was strength, that keeping peace was maturity, that absorbing tension was noble. But there's a difference between compromise and erosion. Compromise leaves both sides intact. Erosion slowly reshapes you until you no longer recognize the edges. I realized that if I backed down now, if I minimized what happened, if I framed it as boys being boys, Theo would internalize that too. He would learn that being pushed down is tolerable, that speaking up is disruptive, that protecting himself creates conflict. I couldn't teach him that. The next morning, I called a family attorney, not to pursue anything aggressive, but to understand my options, to clarify boundaries, to ensure that if this escalated legally or socially, I wasn't navigating it blindly. The consultation was brief but grounding. You're within your rights to document and report, the attorney said. You're also within your rights to limit contact moving forward if you believe it's in your child's best interest. Limit contact. The phrase felt heavier than anything else. I had never imagined distancing from my sister. We grew up sharing a room, whispering secrets late at night, dreaming about futures that once felt intertwined. But adulthood had layered ambition over those memories. Expectations, competition, subtle hierarchy. And now, consequence. When I hung up, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clear. That clarity didn't erase sadness. It didn't erase history. But it anchored me. Later that day, my father left a voicemail. "We can still handle this internally," he said. "There's time." That man. Farting okay. I listened to it twice before deleting it. Handling it internally was what we had done for years. And that's how we ended up here. That night, as I tucked Theo into bed, he asked one more question. "Are you sure I didn't do something wrong?" The fact that he still needed reassurance told me everything. "I'm sure," I said firmly. "And I'll keep being sure." He smiled faintly, then closed his eyes. I stayed in the doorway a moment longer, watching him breathe evenly in the dim glow of his nightlight. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about winning. It wasn't even about proving Mara wrong. It was about teaching my son something simple but foundational. That when someone pushes you down, you don't apologize for falling. And when someone tries to rewrite the story, you don't fund the lie. The $18,000 had been a test. But the real decision wasn't about money. It was about which truth I was willing to stand behind. And I had finally chosen. The day I decided to confront Mara properly, I didn't do it in anger. That surprised me more than anything else. I thought I would feel explosive, loud, shaking with fury. Instead, what I felt was steady, focused, like something inside me had locked into place and refused to move. I asked her to come over that evening. She arrived just before sunset, Eric trailing behind her with that quiet, unreadable expression he always wore when things became uncomfortable. My parents followed shortly after, of course they did. News travels quickly in families like ours, especially when control starts to shift. We gathered in the living room. The lake outside reflected streaks of orange and gold, almost too beautiful for the tension in the room. Theo was upstairs. I made sure of that. "I want to show you something," I said, holding my phone in my hand. Mara crossed her arms instinctively. I noticed it immediately, the same posture from the footage. Defensive. Closed. "This is unnecessary," she began. "No," I said quietly. "It's overdue." I pressed play. The video illuminated the room with a faint blue glow. No sound, just motion. Tucker approaching. Theo stepping back. The shove. The fall. And there, clear and unmistakable Mara, standing a few feet away, watching. The silence in the room thickened as the clip looped once before I paused it. "It's not what it looks like," she said immediately. I almost smiled at how predictable that was. "Then tell me what it looks like," I replied calmly. Eric shifted his weight beside her. "Kids escalate things," he said. "You can't judge a moment without context." "I agree," I said. That's why I asked Theo about it. Mara's eyes flicked up sharply. And? And he said you told Tucker he deserved it. For the first time since walking in, Mara's composure cracked, just slightly, a tightening around the mouth, a flicker of something unsettled. That's not what I meant, she said. What did you mean? She hesitated. I meant he needed to understand the dynamic, she replied carefully. Dad talks about him like he's already the successor. Tucker hears that. It creates imbalance. Imbalance. As if we were discussing a boardroom, not children by a lake. They're boys, my father interjected. Competition happens. They're 12 and 15, I said evenly. They shouldn't be competing over inheritance. My mother looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Mara stepped forward slightly. You've always acted like Theo is fragile. I've always acted like he's my responsibility. You're making Tucker out to be violent. He pushed him, I said. More than once. Eric's jaw tightened. He didn't intend harm. Intent doesn't erase impact. I didn't say it out loud. I didn't need to. It hung between us. You called me at 3 in the morning, I continued, turning back to Mara. You said your life was in danger. I was overwhelmed, she snapped. Things spiraled. Spiraled how? I asked. She glanced at Eric before answering. The police started asking questions. Tucker panicked. I panicked. I thought if we secured legal help quickly, it would stay contained. There it was. Contained. Not resolved. Not addressed. Contained. So the $18,000, I said quietly, was for damage control. Her silence confirmed it. You lied to me, I said. I was protecting my son, she replied sharply. And I'm protecting mine. The words landed harder than anything else that evening. My father stood, pacing once across the room. This is tearing the family apart. No, I said calmly. It's revealing what was already torn. Mara's voice softened suddenly, shifting tactics. Jill, we grew up together. You know I would never intentionally hurt Theo. You didn't have to touch him to hurt him, I replied. She flinched slightly at that. Standing there, I continued, saying nothing that told him everything. Silence again. My mother finally spoke. Can this not be handled privately? An apology? A reset? I thought about that for a moment. It would be easier, cleaner, less public, less disruptive. But I remembered Theo's question. Are you sure I didn't do something wrong? If I reset without accountability, what would that teach him? This isn't about punishment, I said carefully. It's about boundaries. If you SN. Mara's eyes narrowed. So what do you want? I want acknowledgement, I said. That it was wrong. Not competitive. Not contextual. Wrong. The word lingered in the air. Wrong. She looked at Eric. He looked back at her but didn't speak. Finally, she exhaled. It went too far. That's not the same thing, I said. Her shoulders sagged slightly. It was wrong, she said quietly. The admission was small, controlled, but it was there. And the money? I asked. I shouldn't have asked you, she admitted. I didn't know what else to do. You could have told the truth. Her gaze dropped. I was afraid, she whispered. Of what? That once it was official, she said slowly. I couldn't shape it. Shape it. Narrative again. Reputation again. Control again. I felt a strange mix of sadness and clarity wash over me. This wasn't just about one incident. It was about how differently we understood responsibility. You can't shape everything, I said gently. Sometimes you have to own it. Eric finally spoke, his voice measured. What are you asking for now? For Tucker not to be alone with Theo, I said. For communication to go through me. For no more comments about legacy or position in front of them. And for this to be addressed honestly, not buried. My father shook his head slightly. This will change things. Yes, I replied. It will. Mara looked at me for a long time. I couldn't read her expression fully, part defiance, part exhaustion, part something more complicated. You've always been softer than me, she said finally. Maybe, I replied. But soft doesn't mean silent. That seemed to settle something in the room. The confrontation didn't end dramatically. No slammed doors, no shouting, just a slow, uneasy dispersal. My parents left first. Eric followed shortly after, placing a hand briefly on Mara's back. She lingered a moment longer. "I didn't think it would look like that," she said quietly. "It did," I answered. After she left, the house felt heavy but honest. I went upstairs and knocked gently on Theo's door. "It's okay now," I told him when he looked up from his book. He studied my face, searching. "You're not in trouble," I added. "And you never were." He nodded slowly. As I turned off his light later that night, I realized something that hadn't been clear before. The footage hadn't just exposed a shove. It had exposed a belief system. That dominance equals strength. That silence equals unity. That control equals protection. And in that living room, for the first time, I had rejected all three. The $18,000 had been a desperate attempt to contain truth. But truth, once seen, doesn't shrink back into shadows. It demands space, and I had finally made room for it. After that confrontation, I expected things to calm down. They didn't. Instead, the air around everything, family dinners, restaurant operations, even casual phone calls, felt charged. Not explosive, just strained. Like a thin sheet of ice stretched over deep water. 3 days later, Officer Reynolds asked me to come down to the station to sign a formal statement. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell Mara. I drove there alone after dropping Theo at school, gripping the steering wheel harder than necessary the entire way. The building wasn't intimidating. Fluorescent lights, neutral walls, quiet hallways. It felt ordinary. And maybe that's what struck me most, how ordinary accountability looks compared to how dramatic families make it seem. The officer reviewed the footage with me once more, documenting the timeline carefully. He asked clear, measured questions. How long had tensions existed between the boys? Had there been prior incidents? Had there been adult involvement? I answered honestly. Yes. 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 When he asked whether I believed there had been encouragement from an adult, I paused, but only briefly. Yes. Saying it out loud carried weight. Not because I doubted it, but because I knew the ripple it would cause. Afterward, as I walked back to my car, my phone buzzed. 3 missed calls from my mother. 1 from Mara. They already knew. I didn't answer immediately. I sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, staring at the steering wheel, letting the quiet settle before stepping back into the storm. When I finally called my mother back, her voice trembled not with sadness, but with indignation. "You signed something," she said. "Yes. Do you understand what that means?" "It means I told the truth. It means this becomes permanent," she replied sharply. "There are records now, statements. It doesn't just disappear." "That's the point," I said quietly. There was silence on the other end, then my father's voice in the background asking what I'd said. "You're choosing strangers over family," my mother continued. "No," I corrected gently. "I'm choosing accountability." She exhaled heavily. "You've humiliated your sister." "No," I said. "She did that herself." The call ended shortly after, not in resolution, but in exhaustion. Later that afternoon, Mara showed up at the restaurant. Not at my house this time. At my workplace. She waited until the lunch rush thinned before stepping into my office. Her face was pale but composed. "You signed," she said flatly. "Yes." "You could have waited." "For what?" "For us to figure it out." "We had a week," I replied. "And a 3 a.m. phone call." She flinched slightly at that. "This isn't just about Tucker anymore," she said. "This affects everything." End quote. "Everything?" I asked. "The second location," she said. "Shared vendor contracts. Our parents' involvement. You've made it impossible to pretend we're unified." Unified. The word echoed hollowly. "Were we?" I asked softly. Her jaw tightened. "You've always resented how things leaned toward me. That's not what this is." "Isn't it?" she pressed. "You finally have leverage." 8. That accusation stung not because it was accurate, but because it revealed how she interpreted every action through competition. "I don't want leverage," I said calmly. "I want safety." "For who?" she snapped. "For Theo." Her shoulders slumped slightly. "You think I don't care about him?" "I think you cared more about perception." That landed. She looked away first. I panicked, she said quietly. When the officer mentioned footage, I saw everything unraveling. And actual is no. So you tried to control it? Yes. And you tried to pull me into that control. She didn't deny it. There was a long silence between us, thick with everything unsaid. You don't understand what it's like raising Tucker, she said finally. He's strong-willed, competitive. He reacts. That's not an excuse, I replied gently. That's a reason to guide him. Her eyes filled with something close to frustration. You think I didn't try? I think you minimized. John froze. That was harder for her to hear. She leaned against the edge of the desk, crossing her arms again out of habit. If this goes further, she said carefully, it could affect his school record, recommendations, opportunities. And if it doesn't, I answered, it affects what he believes he can get away with. The conversation shifted then, not louder, but deeper. I told him Theo needed to understand dynamics, she admitted quietly. What dynamics? That life isn't handed to you, she said. That favoritism exists. And pushing someone down teaches that? I asked. She didn't respond. I realized something in that moment. Mara wasn't malicious in the theatrical sense. She wasn't plotting harm. She was reacting to perceived imbalance with the tools she understood: competition, correction, containment. But those tools were shaping children. You asked me for $18,000, I said. Did you really believe that would fix it? I believed it would buy time, she replied honestly. For what? To manage it. There it was again. Manage. Shape. Control. You can't manage growth through pressure, I said softly. And you can't manage consequences through money. She looked tired then. Not defeated, just worn. What happens now? She asked. Now we let it proceed, I said. And we set boundaries. What kind of boundaries? Tucker isn't alone with Theo. Discussions about inheritance stop. Comments about strength stop. If you're frustrated, you talk to me, not through them. She nodded slowly, absorbing it. And the restaurant? She asked after a moment. What about it? Our roles, she clarified. You've made it clear trust is fractured. Trust. That word carried more weight than anything else. I need time, I said honestly. And transparency. She nodded again, but I could see the calculation behind her eyes. Not manipulation, just adjustment. Reassessment of position. When she left the office, she didn't slam the door. She walked out quietly, passing the staff with a composed smile that didn't reach her eyes. That evening, my father sent a long email about unity and legacy and protecting what we built. It was thoughtful, articulate, focused entirely on preservation. It didn't mention Theo once. I read it twice before closing my laptop. Later, as I sat on the dock alone, I thought about the word permanent. My mother had said signing that statement made things permanent. She was right. But what had been permanent before was silence. What had been permanent before was imbalance. If something had to solidify, I preferred it be truth. Theo joined me outside after a while, sitting beside me quietly. Are things worse? He asked. They're different, I said. Because of me? No, I answered firmly. Because of choices. Extudiate. He nodded slowly. I don't want anyone to hate me, he said softly. I wrapped my arm around his shoulders. No one hates you, I told him. And if they're angry, it's because things are changing. He leaned into me slightly, and for a moment, the tension of the past week felt smaller than the simple act of sitting beside him. This wasn't about destroying my sister. It wasn't about punishing my nephew. It was about refusing to let harmful patterns become normal. When I looked out at the lake that night, I understood something clearly. You can't keep peace by erasing consequences. And you can't protect children by protecting reputations. Signing that statement didn't tear the family apart. It revealed where the cracks already were. And sometimes, revealing cracks is the first step toward building something stronger or letting something broken finally fall away. A few days after I signed the formal statement, the truth about the $18,000 became clearer and somehow heavier. Officer Reynolds called again, not with urgency this time, but with clarification. We've completed preliminary interviews, he said. Your sister indicated she felt pressured and believed immediate legal consultation was necessary. There was no external criminal threat. No external threat. I had known that already, but hearing it confirmed stripped away the last layer of illusion. So the money, I asked quietly, was for an attorney? Yes, he replied. A retainer. She appeared concerned about potential charges or formal documentation affecting her son's record. Concerned about documentation. Concerned about permanence. Concerned about visibility. Not concerned about why a 15-year-old felt entitled to shove a 12-year-old to assert hierarchy. I thanked him and ended the call, then sat in my office at the restaurant staring at nothing for several long minutes. $18,000. Not ransom. Not danger. Not survival. Control. That was what she had been trying to buy. Control over timing, over narrative, over how quickly accountability could reach her door. And she had assumed I would fund it. That assumption lingered in my mind more than the number itself. It meant she believed my loyalty would override my judgment. That if she framed it as emergency, as family, as love, I would act without asking questions. For years, that had been true. When Mara pushed for expanded authority at the second location, I supported her publicly, even when I disagreed privately. When my parents subtly leaned into her leadership style, I didn't challenge it. I told myself cooperation was maturity. But cooperation without transparency slowly turns into complicity. That afternoon, Mara called. Her voice sounded tired, stripped of its earlier sharpness. They told me, she said. I know there was no threat, I replied evenly. I was scared, she said again. Of what? I asked gently. Of losing control, she admitted after a long pause. The honesty caught me off guard. Control of what? Of the story, she said quietly. Of how it unfolds. Once authorities are involved, you can't direct it. And you wanted to direct it. Yes. De Haven. There was no denial in her voice now. No defensiveness. Just fact. You tried to involve me in that direction, I said. I thought you'd understand, she replied. That sentence hurt more than the lie. You thought I'd understand manipulating the situation? I thought you'd prioritize family. I did, I said softly. Just not in the way you expected. Silence stretched between us. I wasn't trying to hurt Theo, she added. I know, I said. And I meant it. Mara's flaw had never been cruelty. It was competitiveness sharpened by expectation. She had grown up absorbing our parents' praise, their subtle reinforcement that performance equaled worth. When you're raised that way, you don't always recognize when you pass it on. You told Tucker he needed to make sure Theo understood, I said gently. She exhaled slowly. I said he needed to understand dynamics. What dynamics? That nothing is guaranteed, she replied. That Grandpa talks about him like the restaurant is already his. And that justifies pushing him? No, she said quickly. It doesn't. Her voice broke slightly on that word. I misjudged, she admitted. I thought boys needed to toughen each other up. I closed my eyes briefly. Toughness isn't dominance, I said quietly. It's restraint. Another silence. I didn't see it that way, she said. I know. And Kay asked to. The conversation shifted after that, not to apology exactly, but to something closer to acknowledgement. What happens now? She asked. Now the process continues, I replied. And we focus on preventing repetition. You're not pressing charges, she said carefully. I'm not seeking punishment, I answered. I'm seeking accountability. Those two things are different, though people often confuse them. That evening, my father showed up at the restaurant again, more composed than before. He waited until closing and then stepped into my office without knocking. She panicked, he said. I know. You could have given her time. I did, I replied calmly. A week. He paced once across the room, the same way he had in our living room days earlier. You're making her feel isolated, he said. She isolated herself when she asked me to lie. He stopped walking. She wasn't asking you to lie. It's aiding the Puros. She asked me to fund a version of events that excluded the truth, I said evenly. He didn't respond to that directly. You're putting strain on the entire structure, he said instead. The two locations operate under shared agreements. I'm aware. If trust erodes, operations suffer. Then trust needs rebuilding, I replied. He looked at me carefully, as if trying to assess when I became this immovable. You used to avoid confrontation, he said. I used to avoid clarity, I corrected. There's a difference. After he left, I sat in the darkened dining room for a while, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerators in the kitchen. The restaurant had always been neutral groundwork, separate from family tension. Now the lines were blurring. Mara had feared losing control over the narrative. But control had never been sustainable when it relied on silence. That night, Theo came into my room before bed. Did Aunt Mara really think someone was after her? He asked. No, I said gently. Then why did she say that? Because she was afraid, I replied. Of what? I thought carefully before answering. Of consequences. He nodded slowly, processing. Is she mad at me? He asked. No, I said firmly. She's dealing with her own mistakes. He seemed to consider that for a moment. I don't want Tucker to hate me, he said quietly. He doesn't hate you, I replied. He was reacting to something he didn't understand. Like what? Pressure, I said. Expectations that weren't his to carry. Theo nodded again, though I wasn't sure he fully grasped it. And maybe he didn't need to yet. As he left the room, I realized something that had been forming quietly over the past week. The $18,000 had never truly been about legal fees. It had been about testing whether I would choose reflex over reason, whether I would choose old family patterns over new boundaries, whether I would choose image over integrity. For years, I might have transferred the money without hesitation. I might have rationalized it as helping. But helping someone avoid accountability isn't help, it's reinforcement. The next morning, I transferred $18 into Theo's savings account instead. It was symbolic, small, almost silly. But it reminded me of something important. Money isn't the foundation of security. Clarity is. And for the first time in a long time, I felt clear. A week after everything became official, I made the decision that scared me more than signing any statement or sending any footage. I decided Mara would no longer manage any part of my restaurant. That may sound sudden, even retaliatory, but it wasn't. It was the result of quiet observation over years, sharpened by what I now understood about control and narrative. Harper's Lakeside, the original location, had always been mine to run. Mara managed the second branch across town, the one our parents helped finance years ago. But operations overlapped. Vendor accounts were shared. Certain supplier contracts carried both our names. Financial systems had partial access points between locations. Trust had been the foundation of that structure. And trust was fractured. I didn't announce it publicly. I didn't make a scene. I called a meeting in my office with Connie present and asked Mara to come alone. She arrived, guarded but composed, as she always did when she sensed something shifting. You're restructuring, she said before I even spoke. Yes. In response to this? In response to clarity, I corrected gently. She sat down across from me, folding her hands tightly in her lap. For the first time since this began, she didn't lead with accusation. What are you changing? She asked. I'm separating operational access, I said calmly. Vendor contracts will no longer overlap. Financial systems will be isolated. The main location will operate independently. Her jaw tightened. That's drastic. It's necessary. For safety, she asked pointedly. For stability, I replied. There was a long silence. You don't trust me, she said finally. I didn't rush to deny it. I trust that you love your son, I said. But I don't trust how you manage perception. She looked down briefly, then back at me. You think I'd manipulate business records? I think you act quickly when you feel control slipping, I answered honestly. That wasn't cruelty. It was observation. Her shoulders slumped slightly. You're making this permanent. No, I said. I'm making it transparent. That distinction mattered to me more than anything. For years, the structure between our two restaurants relied on assumptions that we would always align, that family tension wouldn't seep into operations, that legacy could be quietly negotiated behind closed doors. Now I understood that silence wasn't neutral. It allowed narratives to form without scrutiny. I built this location from scratch, I continued softly. After the divorce, after the loans, after the nights sleeping on that office couch because I couldn't afford staff yet. I won't risk instability because we're uncomfortable. She looked at me differently then, not as a rival, but as someone she was seeing clearly for perhaps the first time in a long while. You think I would sabotage you, she said quietly. No, I replied. I think pressure changes how you respond. Another silence. What about the future? She asked. What about it? You've always said Theo would inherit this one. I have, I said. And you don't see how that affects Tucker. There it was again. Inheritance as competition. I see how adults framing it that way affects both of them, I replied. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling for a moment. I never meant for it to turn into that. But it did. Yes, she whispered. The honesty in that admission felt heavier than anything else we'd said. I'm not cutting you out of the family, I added gently. But I am drawing boundaries. 18 time. What kind? Operational independence. Clear communication. No more conversations about legacy in front of the boys. And Tucker doesn't come to this house unless we're present. Her expression tightened at that last point. You're restricting him. I'm protecting Theo. The difference mattered to me, even if it felt the same to her. Later that evening, I called my parents and explained the restructuring. Predictably, they were unsettled. You're dividing assets unnecessarily, my father said. I'm dividing responsibilities, I corrected. This will send a message to staff, my mother added. Yes, I said calmly, that we operate professionally. There was silence on the line. You've changed, my father said finally. No, I replied. I've stopped pretending. That night, as I updated access permissions and reviewed vendor agreements with Connie, I felt a strange combination of grief and relief. Grief for what had once felt seamless. Relief that I was no longer navigating blurred lines. Connie watched me carefully as I signed off on the new structure. You sure? She asked quietly. Yes. You know this won't smooth over easily. I'm not smoothing anymore, I said. She smiled faintly at that. The next morning, I took Theo to the restaurant before school. I showed him the office where I used to sleep on the couch during renovations. The invoices framed on the wall from our first profitable month. The old photos of him at 5 years old sitting on a flour sack. This place, I said gently, was never about competition. He looked up at me, curious. It's about care, I continued. Care for the people who come in, care for the people who work here, and care for you. He nodded slowly. I don't want it if it makes people mad, he said softly. It doesn't belong to anger, I replied. It belongs to responsibility. I stow. He seemed to think about that deeply. Later that week, Eric requested a meeting. He approached it more strategically than emotionally. You're isolating our branch, he said. I'm clarifying it, I replied. He studied me carefully. You've always underestimated how competitive this industry is. And you've always underestimated how important trust is, I answered. He didn't argue. You're willing to risk family for principle, he said. I'm willing to risk comfort for safety, I replied. He nodded slowly, as if recalculating something internally. As the weeks passed, the new structure settled into place. Vendor calls were smoother, financial reviews were cleaner. Staff sensed the shift but didn't question it openly. They simply operated. Mara and I spoke less, but when we did, it was direct, controlled, no longer layered with unspoken hierarchy. And something else changed quietly too. Theo stopped asking if he had done something wrong. He began standing a little straighter, talking a little more openly. Not because everything was fixed, but because the ambiguity was gone. Ambiguity breeds self-doubt. Clarity builds confidence. One evening, as I locked up the restaurant, I stood beneath the old wooden sign Harper's Lakeside and thought about what legacy truly means. It isn't about ownership. It isn't about titles. It's about the values you reinforce when it costs you something. Separating operations wasn't revenge. It wasn't punishment. It was acknowledgement that blurred lines had allowed blurred accountability. And now, for the first time in years, the lines were clear. Family might still be complicated, but the foundation beneath my son's feet no longer was. Once the operational lines were drawn and the paperwork settled, I thought the hardest part was behind me. I was wrong. The hardest part wasn't the confrontation. It wasn't signing the statement. It wasn't even restructuring the business. It was sitting with the aftermath. The legal process moved slowly and quietly. There were no dramatic courtrooms or flashing lights, just documentation, follow-up interviews, and careful evaluation. Officer Reynolds reassured me repeatedly that the focus was restorative, not punitive. The goal was accountability and prevention, not destruction. Still, the word investigation lingered like a shadow over everything. Tucker was required to attend a behavioral evaluation through the school. Theo was offered counseling services. I accepted immediately, not because I believed he was damaged, but because I wanted him to know that asking for support wasn't weakness. The first time I drove him to his appointment, he stared out the passenger window quietly. "Do you think I need this?" he asked. "I think everyone benefits from someone neutral to talk to," I replied gently. "Like you?" "Different," I said with a small smile. "Someone who doesn't love you so much that they worry about everything." That made him laugh softly, and the tension eased just a little. The counselor later told me something that stayed with me. "He's not angry," she said. "He's confused." Confusion can be more corrosive than anger. Anger burns and fades. Confusion lingers. "He thought if he acted smaller it would stop," she added. That sentence hollowed me out. Acted smaller. Shrank. Reduced himself to avoid conflict. I drove home that afternoon, gripping the steering wheel tighter than I had during any police call, because that realization wasn't about Tucker. It wasn't about Mara. It was about the invisible message Theo had internalized. If you take up less space, you'll be safer. No child should learn that. Meanwhile, Tucker began meeting with a school counselor as well. I didn't hear details, and I didn't ask. That wasn't my role. But through mutual acquaintances, I learned he struggled with pressure, academic expectations, comparisons, a sense that he needed to assert dominance to maintain standing. Pressure. The word surfaced again. Pressure from legacy, from adults projecting futures onto children. One evening, Eric called unexpectedly. "We're cooperating fully," he said without preamble. "I know," I replied. "This doesn't need to escalate." "It won't, if it's addressed," I said calmly. There was a pause. "Tucker didn't realize how much it affected Theo," he added. "That's part of the problem," I answered. "Impact doesn't wait for realization." He didn't argue. For the first time, his voice lacked calculation. It carried fatigue. "He feels ashamed," Eric admitted quietly. "Shame can either harden someone or humble them." "I hope it leads to growth," I said. "I do too." After we hung up, I sat alone in the darkened kitchen and thought about how strange it was that we were finally having honest conversations only after everything fractured. Why does it take exposure to produce transparency? My parents remained distant but not hostile. Their tone softened gradually as it became clear that the sky wasn't falling, that the restaurant was stable, that customers still came, that the town wasn't gossiping the way they had feared. Reputation had survived. But something else had shifted permanently. The illusion that silence equals protection. One Sunday afternoon, my mother stopped by with a pie, an old habit from before things became complicated. She sat at the kitchen table while Theo was outside with a book. "He seems lighter," she observed. "He is," I said. She folded her hands carefully. "I didn't realize he felt that way." "I know. I thought boys sorted things out," she said. "They do," I replied. "When they're given tools, not when they're given hierarchy." She nodded slowly, absorbing it. "Your sister is reflecting," she added carefully. "I hope so." There was a long silence between us, not hostile, just thoughtful. "You were brave," she said finally. I almost laughed. "It didn't feel brave," I replied. "It felt necessary." Bravery implies choice without cost. This had cost plenty: tension, distance, uncertainty. But it also gave something back. Clarity. The following week, Theo's counselor suggested a joint session, just the two of us. I agreed. During that session, Theo spoke more openly than he ever had at home. "I didn't want Mom to fight everyone," he admitted quietly. The counselor asked him why. Because I thought it was my fault, he said. Hearing that in a neutral room, without defensive walls or family dynamics, made the truth sharper. You never caused this, I said firmly, looking directly at him. He nodded, but his eyes were still searching. The counselor later explained something that reshaped how I understood the situation. When children experience conflict tied to identity, like inheritance or favoritism, they often assume responsibility for the tension. They believe if they change, the tension dissolves. To say this, I'm said over. That's what he had been doing. Trying to shrink, trying to dissolve himself. Driving home, I made a quiet promise to myself. No more conversations about legacy in front of him. No more framing of future ownership as a prize. No more subtle comparisons. I wasn't raising a successor. I was raising a human being. Meanwhile, the official review concluded without severe penalties. Tucker was required to complete conflict resolution sessions and community engagement through school programs. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't public. It was structured accountability. Mara called a few days after that. It's over, she said. It's addressed, I corrected gently. There was a pause. I've been thinking, she added, about how much we talk about control. And? I asked. I think I confuse control with security, she admitted. That was the most honest sentence she had spoken since this began. I understand that, I said softly. But control isn't security if it harms someone else. Asked her. I know, she replied. We didn't resolve everything in that call. We didn't pretend nothing happened. But the edge in her voice had softened. Growth isn't loud. It's incremental. One evening, as I closed the restaurant, Theo stood beside me under the old wooden sign. Are things okay now? He asked. They're better, I said. Because you didn't send the money? He added quietly. I looked at him, surprised by how closely he had followed everything. Yes, I answered. Because I didn't buy silence. He nodded slowly. I'm glad, he said. So was I. The aftermath wasn't glamorous. It wasn't triumphant. It was quiet recalibration. Boundaries drawn. Assumptions corrected. Conversations forced into the open. Sometimes the most powerful decisions aren't dramatic at all. They're the steady ones, the ones you repeat daily in how you speak, what you allow, and what you refuse to fund. The $18,000 would have been easier in the moment, but clarity costs less in the long run. And for the first time since that 3 a.m. call, I slept through the night without the phone feeling like a threat beside my bed. A few weeks after the investigation formally concluded, I made another decision, one that had nothing to do with lawyers or police reports, but everything to do with healing. I decided to change the name of the restaurant. Not to erase the past, not to punish anyone, but to anchor the future somewhere different. For years, the wooden sign above the entrance read Harper's Lakeside. It carried our family name, our history, our shared effort. It also carried expectations, spoken and unspoken, about who would eventually lead, who would inherit, who was more suited. The name wasn't the problem, but the weight behind it had become complicated. One afternoon, I drove to the sign company 10 minutes outside town. I had already sketched the design weeks earlier, long before I was ready to admit it to myself. It sat folded in my desk drawer like a quiet promise. When I unrolled it on the counter, the designer raised an eyebrow. You sure? He asked. Yes, I said. The new sign would read, Theo's Lakeside Kitchen. Not flashy, not dramatic, just honest. When the workers arrived to replace the sign, I didn't announce it publicly. I let it happen gradually. Staff gathered outside as the old letters were carefully removed. No one clapped. No one cheered. It wasn't a spectacle. It was a transition. Connie stood beside me as the new sign was lifted into place. This is more than a name change, she said quietly. I know, I replied. It's a declaration. Yes. A declaration that this place wasn't about hierarchy. It wasn't about control. It was about stewardship. When Theo came by after school that day, I didn't say anything at first. I just pointed upward. He froze beneath the sign. That's my name, he said slowly. It is. His eyes widened, not with pride exactly, but with disbelief. You didn't have to do that, he said. I wanted to. But what about Grandpa? He asked carefully. What about him? He liked the old name. I smiled gently. Names can change, values shouldn't. He stood there for a long moment, looking up at the letters like they might disappear if he blinked. It feels different, he said. Getter. How? Safer, he replied. That word settled into me like confirmation. Over the next few weeks, the restaurant seemed lighter. Not busier necessarily, not louder, just steadier. Staff adjusted easily. Customers asked questions, and I answered them simply. It's a new chapter, I'd say. And it was. Mara didn't come by at first. I didn't expect her to. When she eventually drove past one afternoon and saw the sign for herself, she called later that evening. You made it official, she said. Yes. You're serious about this. I am. There was a pause. You're giving him something early, she said. I'm giving him belonging, I corrected gently. Silence. I never wanted him to feel unwelcome, she said quietly. I know, I replied. But he did. That part hung between us without argument. I'm trying to adjust, she added after a moment. That's all I'm asking, I said. Eric reached out as well, not with criticism, but with cautious practicality. You've separated operations, he said. And now the branding. Are you planning further division? I'm planning clarity, I replied. He didn't argue. I'll admit, he said slowly. Things are calmer than I expected. That's because we stopped pretending, I answered. The restructuring had worked. Financially, operationally, emotionally. Vendor relationships were stable. Staff morale was high. And most importantly, Theo walked into that building differently now. He wasn't shrinking anymore. One Saturday afternoon, I found him in the kitchen with Connie, carefully measuring flour. What are you two doing? I asked. Testing dough ratios, Connie said with a grin. Theo looked up. If we increase hydration by 5%, it rises differently. In Axtwell Day, he said it with such quiet confidence that I felt something swell in my chest. He wasn't competing. He was creating. Later that evening, as we closed up together, he lingered under the new sign. Does this mean I have to run it someday? He asked. No, I said firmly. It means you're welcome here, that's all. He nodded slowly. I like that better, he admitted. So did I. A few days later, my parents came by together. They stood outside for a long moment before entering, as if adjusting to the new name. My father studied the sign carefully. It's bold, he said. It's intentional, I replied. Inside, they walked slowly through the dining room, taking in the subtle changes I'd made, framed photos of staff, a small plaque near the entrance, about community partnerships, a corner table labeled Lakeview Kids, where local students could study after school. You've shifted the focus, my mother observed. Yes. To what? Community, I said. Not competition. My father didn't argue. He just nodded thoughtfully. Business is steady? He asked. Stronger, I replied. He seemed relieved by that, more than anything else. Before leaving, my mother paused near the door. He seems happier, she said softly, glancing at Theo, who was laughing with a server near the counter. He is, I answered. She looked at me for a long moment. You were right to act, she said quietly. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it mattered. That night, as I locked the doors and turned off the lights, I stood alone under the new sign. The lake reflected its glow softly in the distance. For years, I had believed legacy was about continuity, passing something unchanged from one generation to the next. Now I understood it differently. Legacy is about correction. It's about taking what was flawed and reshaping it before handing it forward. Theo didn't need ownership to feel secure. He needed assurance that he wasn't a pawn in adult rivalries. Changing the name didn't erase what happened. It reframed it. It turned a story about control into a story about care. And when I looked at those letters, Theo's lakeside kitchen, I didn't see defiance. I saw direction, not toward dominance, not toward hierarchy, but toward something steadier. A place where belonging isn't earned through pressure. It's given through trust. Looking back on everything, the 3 a.m. phone call, The $18,000, the footage by the dock, the fractured conversations. I realized this story was never really about money. It wasn't even about a shove between two boys. It was about what we choose to protect when pressure rises. Reputation or truth. Control or accountability. Comfort or clarity. For a long time, I believed loyalty meant smoothing things over. I believed protecting family meant keeping conflict contained. But what this journey taught me is something much simpler and much harder. Real protection isn't silence. It's standing still when everything in you wants to avoid disruption. It's choosing long-term safety over short-term peace. And sometimes, it's refusing to fund a lie, even when that lie comes from someone you love. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to draw boundaries with family, or choose integrity over approval, then you understand how complicated love can be. Thank you for listening to mine. If you want to hear more real, layered stories about family, trust, and the quiet decisions that change everything, please subscribe to Revenge Tale Network. Your support allows these stories to continue, one truth at a time.